Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this conversation on stable housing and unstable times. As Mark mentioned, my name is Lawrence Bowdish. I'm the Executive Director for Issue Networks and Research for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. I'm stepping in for our good friend Jeff Terry at GAF, who texted me to let me know he was so sick, worrying about the Clemson-Wake Forest game this weekend. I know it's been a tough season for the Tigers, but hoping for a speedy recovery for Jeff and his favorite South Carolina team, OH. Stable housing and home ownership particularly have long been the bedrock of the American dream. It's been promoted for almost a century now as a way to build communities and household wealth. So stable access to home ownership has been paramount for many philanthropic and corporate citizenship efforts based on the community. I'm really thrilled to be joined by two great partners. As Mark mentioned, first I have Eileen Fitzgerald, who's the head of Housing Affordability Philanthropy with Wells Fargo, and Melissa McDonald, who's the president of Liberty Mutual Foundation and vice president of Liberty Mutual Insurance. So we've witnessed a lot of turmoil in housing, not only in the past 20, 40, 50 years, but given the recent economic impact of the pandemic, a lot of these issues have been exacerbated. We know that disrupted housing can have a significant negative impact on people and communities. So I'd like to start out by hearing about why stable housing matters and what your company is doing about it. Eileen, can we start with you?
Sure, that sounds great. So, stable housing is really housing that is affordable and it's safe and healthy. I thought it might be helpful to take a second to really dive into what that constitutes housing affordability. And the bottom line is that people can pay their rent or their mortgage and still have money left to meet other life essentials. But also sometimes we don't think about that. The housing cost is rent or mortgage, but plus taxes, utilities, insurance, and other fees. But also we have to think about housing and transportation, because often people are like, okay, I'll move out further. I'll move much further from my job and I can afford to make that rent or mortgage payment. But then that transportation cost can be, really significant for folks, or they're now not near public transit and have to rely on a vehicle to work every day. So as we think about that and stable housing, the transportation costs really tie in. Housing affordability, though, is also a function of both income and housing costs. So it's not just an issue in high cost areas. Often people think, oh, San Francisco, DC, New York, but there's other places, because if you have a lot of service workers or tourism workers whose incomes are lower, you still can have a huge housing affordability problem and therefore a stable housing problem. So, we know that with the challenges given the current housing crisis and very low inventory, we're really pleased that the Chamber is excited about this issue and talking about it. What happens when someone doesn't have stable housing? Well, you have food insecurity. They're making a choice. I mean, this is all about choices, right? And I think what we saw in COVID was that people prioritized housing. They understood how incredibly important it was to be housed. So they have food insecurity or making choices to not be able to have healthy food. Often we hear about this lack of funds for healthcare and prescriptions, and that goes from families to elderly people, alternating, not taking their medicine every day, not going for healthcare. Incredible amount of stress. And I think this is especially important as employers to think about when someone's worried about losing their home, their place they're living and living with their family every day. That just brings huge stress. It also contributes to financial instability with no reserves. So if you're paying too much of your income for your rent or your mortgage, then you're not getting to saving at all. And if you have one crisis, it can create, essentially homelessness. So that loss of stable housing, and again, when we talk about stable housing, it is affordable, but it's also healthy and safe, the place you want to be. And that is, a healthy place to live. So when you have that loss of that, you obviously could have potential eviction, but sometimes people move to other choices that are just really much harder and then wind up being evicted. But also health issues, especially in subpar places, poor educational outcomes, having children move, and then overcrowding with friends and relatives. So I just want to say, knowing the importance of housing stability, and especially in response to COVID, Since 2020, Wells Fargo provided more than $25 million to help keep more than 250,000 people housed. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Eileen. So Melissa, Eileen is talking a lot about individuals, massive amounts of individuals worried about losing that stable housing. And you're working primarily with people who have lost it or are in the process of actively losing it. So curious if you can talk a little bit about what Liberty Mutual is doing in that space.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And thank you so much, Lawrence. And thank you, Eileen. It's an honor to be on this panel with you. And we didn't plan it this way, but Eileen has given us some awesome perspective from a macro level. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a micro perspective because, like you said, Lawrence, we are very much focused on individuals and the impact that it's having on individuals. And as Eileen mentioned, obviously employment, health, education are all impacted. The impact of unstable housing on children and youth is well documented between mental health challenges, developmental delays, academic loss. Our belief is, that people need a sense of security in order to build their futures. And so for that reason, homelessness is one of our areas of focus. And we've invested in, such programming as supportive housing for chronically homeless adults and veterans, eviction prevention, which is so incredibly important these days with COVID. And of course, tax credits. But we also lean in really heavily to support youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. And in fact, 50% of those who are chronically homeless today were homeless as youth. So it's a critical time of intervention. And it is really, really hard to imagine what COVID has meant for a population of homeless youth who have relied on friends' couches in order to serve from one place to another, and shelter beds that were reduced in numbers. It's also hard to know exactly the level of vulnerability of the more than 120,000 children we know lost a parent or guardian in the first 14 months of COVID, or the thousands of young people who may have exited foster care since the beginning of the pandemic. So it's a ton of vulnerability and that existed pre-pandemic and has only been exacerbated since. I thought it might be really cool to share a few examples of some of the things we're doing that I think are really just really neat models. One is the Liberty House. It's a co-op style home for young people who would otherwise be homeless and are attending college or career training programs. Liberty purchased this house for one of our premier partners, Bridge Over Troubled Waters. There's another really interesting example of providing stable housing that is in the workforce development space for an organization called More Than Words. Now, typically you see housing first programs. So you get someone housed and then you add on the services. This kind of flips that model on its head. This effort plugs in housing alongside social service programs where young people who are already showing up at this social service agency, who already have relationships with the team there, are now getting access to housing. And just one last example is a program called My First Place. It's shared apartments that mesh independent living with caseworkers for young people who have aged out of foster care. Young people take on added responsibilities, whether it's getting a job, paying their rent, building their independence. And one of the stats I think is really important for us to all know is that nationally, 46% of young people who age out of foster care will become homeless within 18 months. So we're approaching stable housing in a really targeted, very strategic way for different populations.
Great. Melissa, I wonder if you can stay with us for a second, because you really bring up sort of what we're going to talk about next, and that is developing important partnerships. These aren't issues that any individual or group of corporation can solve. How important is it? And if you've given some examples, you mentioned some partnerships and partners. I'm curious if you can dive into that just a little bit more, on any government or nonprofit partners you work with to execute your work.
Yeah, that is a great point, Lawrence. Great point. We can absolutely not do this work alone. So, our work in youth homelessness actually began when we listened to school teachers and administrators who were telling us about more and more students who were showing up who were obviously homeless. They had backpacks that were just stuffed with everything that child owned. And the adult shelters were telling us they were turning away more and more young people. So several years ago, we approached City Hall, we approached the public school system and the Department of Public Health, and we've been consistently working with them ever since, as well as with our state colleagues, our federal government, and our local community partners. I am part of the Mayor's Task Force to End Youth and Young Adult Homelessness. I'm at a table with over 30 people. I am the only corporate person in the House, but Liberty helped the city receive a $4.9 million grant from HUD. But this collaborative process and effort is successful because we are different. We are all different at that table. Personally, I've learned so much about the issue of homelessness, and frankly, I thought I knew a lot going in these meetings, but just listening to the voices of young people with lived experience, having access to what providers feel is the most valuable research, and prioritizing our actions with others so that we're aligned. It's not without its challenges, because we are all very different, coming from all different types of organizations, institutions, backgrounds. But ultimately, I firmly believe that our community is so much better off because of it.
Eileen, curious if there's any specific partnerships, nonprofit, government, NGO, anything in that space that you feel have been really instrumental to Wells's work.
Yeah, so I think I'd like to just go a little upstream. So from what Melissa was talking about, and at many levels, we're participating in partnerships and with government at Wells Fargo as a lender. We're one of the largest low-income housing tax credit lenders and investors in the nation, usually about $4 to $5 billion a year, producing thousands of units. That is by definition like the biggest public-private partnership with nonprofits, government, and for-profit developers. And it's absolutely critical to increase affordable supply because without that, we get into the spiral that we're now talking about. But I also wanted to talk about just, I guess, going towards that eviction and thinking of upstream. How can we support organizations in addition to supply that help people avoid eviction? And one of the things we did during, in response really to COVID, as I mentioned, we have this big initiative of keeping people housed, and that is with housing counseling organizations and legal assistance organizations. And I think the thing that I'm most proud of is that we were able to get money out really quickly and really flexibly. So in March and April of 2020, and then we did the same thing again this year, we said, oh my gosh, this is coming and we're just not ready for it, any of us. And we talked to our grantees and our stakeholders and partners and said, what's really the need? So we put out several millions of dollars to housing counseling organizations to really help them sometimes just ramp up on their technology. Folks had never worked virtually. They didn't have the systems. They didn't have literally the screens, the laptops, et cetera. So we did that, and then also, training staff, bringing information about how to really work with renters in crisis. And what that did is then when the government money started to come, they were really able to optimize that and access that. The same thing on legal assistance, because we know that 90% of most renters don't have any representation, while almost all landlords do. And that just creates a very uneven playing field. But the same thing, legal assistance organizations often operating on a shoestring. So sometimes they used it for technology, sometimes to improve triage, sometimes to hire more lawyers or other folks they called housing navigators. But the idea here was, let's help them get their capacity. And we have heard many examples of how that helped them then work with their local governments and, you know, really build and get in there and come up with good eviction diversion programs. And the same thing this year, it's all about getting that emergency rental assistance and homeownership assistance money out there. Put a timer on so I wouldn't miss this. And making that, so we're doing that same piece. I just want to add one plug. If there's a great book called Evicted by Matt Desmond, very kind of easy read, really helps you understand so much of what is the challenge out there.
Thanks, Elaine, appreciate it. With the couple minutes we have left, I want to just ask in this last question, you know, these issues are actively changing, they're evolving. You know, Eileen, you sort of just talked about sort of some of the evolution of some of these issues. Curious for both of you, and Eileen, we'll start with you. Do you have any advice for companies that want to step into these topics? Like, what should they be doing now to get engaged?
Absolutely. So proactively provide information on the emergency rental and homeownership assistance that's out there to your employees and your customers. Facilitate financial coaching or housing counseling for employees. Dispel myths on homeownership. We're not talking about that right now, but often people think they have to have 10 or 20% down payment. That's not required. And provide match savings or down payment assistance. Really help your employees, your board, your customers understand the housing crisis and dispel misunderstandings of people who are homeless. Invite nonprofit housing providers and agencies in your communities to share their stories, and look for employee volunteer programs. I mean, there is nothing like really understanding an issue. And then this is super important. As an employer, as a corporation, your community, engage on how you increase supply with your zoning reform, local trust funds, tax credit density bonuses. Make it known that having affordable housing that people can afford nearby is really critical for your organization.
Melissa, same question.
Yeah, I would say, well, first of all, I'd say that being in this session is a great start. Be prepared to spend a significant amount of time just listening to those who are already doing a lot of work in this space. You know, talking with other corporate experts. United Way, National Alliance to End Homelessness is a terrific resource. Get the data from public sources, and if it's not available, commission it from higher education or policy institutes, because we all know data talks and it drives programming. And find out where public funding is, as Eileen mentioned, and try to identify the gaps so that as a private sector leader, you can really step in and leverage public resources, but also know where there are opportunities to make the field better. And then lastly, and certainly not least, engage in roundtables that bring you in contact with people who are directly impacted. Your best insights will likely always come from those with lived experience who can really reflect on how existing services are working and where there are the biggest gaps.
Great. Thanks so much, Eileen and Melissa. Great talk, great conversation to start us off here on day 2. I hope everyone sticks around and joins us for our good friends at Points to Light and Jennifer Lawson, who's going to run Small Business Big Impact. Thanks so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much.